Welcome to the audio commentary for The Last Starfighter. I am Mike White, and thank you for joining me today. Hopefully, we'll have a little bit of fun, talk about The Last Starfighter, and maybe learn something as we go on this journey together. Lormar logo, you don't see those too often anymore. In fact, I don't think we've seen one of those since The Witches back in 1990. We're starting with Rylos. I can assume that's Rylos. Never been there, but from what I understand, it's very pretty. And we're going to start backing away. It's kind of something that Robert Zemeckis would use in Contact almost. We're starting at Rylos, heading out to Earth, as opposed to, I think, with that one we pulled out from Earth. And then these credits are a little bit of, I would say, an homage to Superman, though we are starting and then pushing away instead of coming in. Got this fantastic score from composer Craig Safin, who had worked with the director Nick Castle on his previous film, which was actually his first feature as a director, Tag, the Assassination Game. I've always been impressed by Safin's ability to provide just so many different types of scores. He did a wonderful atonal score for Wolfen, which was ultimately rejected. And he would do great music for Fade to Black. Remo Williams' The Adventure Begins is a favorite. And he would go on to work with Castle again on Mr. Wrong, Major Pain, and Delivering Milo. Ron Cobb, we're going to be talking quite a bit about him as we go along. Just passing Saturn, which we will see again. We'll definitely be talking about computer effects as we go along here as well. This was a major milestone in computer effects. I am assuming that is the moon, and we're doing a match cut to the moon in the sky, but I don't know how necessarily effective that is. Going to be doing a little bit of a dissolve in the clouds and tilt down over to the Starlight Starbright Trailer Park. It's a sleepy little burg with dogs on the steps and cats in the mailboxes. This was shot at a real trailer park north of Los Angeles in Soledad Canyon. And from what Lance Guest told me, several residents were put up at a hotel where they were shooting in these real trailers.
Good morning. It's 8 o'clock in wonderful Coombs County, where once again state police have refused to confirm or deny more of those mysterious lights in the sky sightings by local residents.
It's depending on where you went, the budget for this film was either 13 million, as Cinefantastique put it, 16 million in one issue of Starlog, or 22 million, which they said in the next issue of Starlog. I tend to think of it as being the larger number. We're going to meet Otis, our first human character here, played by Vernon Washington. Thankfully, he's going to be providing our main character, Alex Rogan, with some advice, but he doesn't fall into any of the common movie tropes for African American actors. He's not magical, nor is he just 100% sage. Kind of nice that we're meeting Mags here, played by Catherine Mary Stewart, even before we meet Alex, who's played by Lance Guest. She gets to take us through the park, show us the communication system that we have of when one of the residents' electricity goes out and she needs to see her stories.
Hi, Maggie. Did you find that picnic basket yet?
Also, according to Cinefantastique, the film had a $3 million computer effects budget, which also feels low. That went over to Digital Productions, a California company that was headed by John Whitney Jr. The effects were rendered on a Cray supercomputer. Cray would later be bought out by Silicon Graphics and then eventually Hewlett Packard. I looked everywhere and could not find just how much computing power a Cray supercomputer had. I thought it would be one of those ironic things where, oh, and you could do this all on your phone now. That's how much computing power it is, but I think it was a little bit more. Director Nick Castle was very quick to dismiss the idea that The Last Starfighter had any similarities to Tron, which in 1982 was both a pioneer of effect technology and centered on a video game, as this film does. Though I can say when our main character goes through his little journey with Centauri, it's almost like he's passing from real life into a video game, becoming part of this simulation that he's playing here. And I mentioned Tag earlier. Castle came to The Last Starfighter thanks to somebody at Lorimar seeing Tag and thinking that it was, quote, cute, that it had a good look to it, and that the director had handled the actors nicely. And when Castle met with Lorimar after reading the Jonathan Betchel script, he said he had a lot of problems with it, went through that with them page by page, and rather than telling him to take a hike, they agreed that he should work on it with Jonathan Betchel. And Betchel recounts that he and Castle would talk, then Betchel would write a draft, they'd talk some more, he'd write another draft. In all, he said that he wrote 14 drafts of the screenplay over a 6-month period of time. It's kind of interesting. One of the things they feared the most was that by the time the film came out, that the whole video game craze would be over. I had no memory of the major recession in the video game industry. It's often referred to as the video game crash of 1983. I mostly learned about that through the documentary Atari Game Over, which came out in 2014. Though it shouldn't be overlooked that video arcades, when they did have their time in the sun, it was all too brief. One of the reasons why they were often shut down wasn't necessarily for lack of business, but because they were seen as being dens of iniquity, as they were portrayed in Graydon Clark's seminal film Joysticks from 1983. Poor Alex is a teenager with adult responsibilities. His game playing could be seen as one of the last vestiges of childhood onto which he's able to hang on tight with both hands. Indeed, the game requires him to use both hands for the controls. But luckily, Alex doesn't openly complain about his responsibilities. It's not like Luke Skywalker whining about going to Tashi Station to pick up some power converters. The film is aware of and calls out to Arthurian legend, finding the once and future king via pulling a sword from a stone. In this case, the sword is a video game. And screenwriter Jonathan Betchel was a junior copywriter at an advertising agency who had turned to writing screenplays in his downtime between accounts. On a lunch break, he went into a video arcade where he saw the intensity of a young man playing a video game. Coincidentally, he had been in the process of reading T.H. White's Once and Future King, and voila, idea was born. Alex Rogan, both metaphorically and literally, looks to the stars, what with his model here of the solar system. And we saw a nice picture of Paris on the back of his door. He is desperate to get away. It kind of reminds me of Kurt Henderson from American Graffiti, the Richard Dreyfuss character. He's desperate to get out of Mill Valley, doesn't want to get stuck going to City College like the rest of the kids he's been hanging out with. He doesn't seem to be superior to his friends. He just doesn't want to be stuck fixing TV antennas at the Starbright trailer park for the rest of his days. He feels that he's meant for bigger things. He doesn't know that it is the Starfighter video game that will bring him to the bigger things. And like Otis tells him, he has to grab on tight, not let go. Depending on what story you read, Nick Castle recounted in some interviews that the original screenplay was set in suburbia, which kind of brought it too close to Steven Spielberg's turf. In other versions of the story, he says that it was set in the desert, which would have put him in George Lucas territory, what with Luke Skywalker living out in the desert. Regardless which story you believe, Alex ended up at a trailer park, almost kind of hidden away from the world, perhaps a bit more like being furthest from the brightest spot in the universe. So yeah, Alex, he's interesting to me because he's a reluctant hero. Despite all the talk about special effects that we're going to be doing on this track, the most important thing about The Last Starfighter is that it's a human story. The reluctance of Alex Rogan is another aspect that Castle and Betchel worked out during their story conferences. Castle said that, quote, he's a kid who really wants to get out of his situation and he gets his chance. But will he really put his money where his mouth is? According to Castle, in the early drafts of the script, Alex didn't return to Earth and meet the beta unit until the end of the film. Having Alex return to Earth more in the middle of the movie to show his hesitation is really crucial to his character.
Thanks, Jack.
You're welcome.
Good night.
I like that even though she's being dropped off by a lone other man, that Alex is not necessarily jealous of the other guy. He's more jealous of her being able to get away, also jealous that he can't get away from all of his duties. Took me the longest time to realize that this video game is out in front of a store that is Otis who runs the store, one of the kind of central places of the trailer park.
Where's everybody else?
They went to a movie.
I was talking about the effects, and Castle considered the effects in Tron to be very low res.
He said it was on his way home.
He told Cinefantastique that, quote, there's been a conscious effort not to draw attention to digital or to the presence of computer simulation, mainly because we've gone for simulation that gives a photoreal look. What we expect to happen in the film community, we'll see that computer graphics can now match motion controlled graphics in terms of special effects. For instance, we can do multiple elements in a single pass or start from 5 miles out and zoom right into something. The technique could revolutionize the effects industry. And I don't necessarily know why this film isn't hailed more as being this effects giant. And I sometimes wonder if it's because the effects are photoreal. I mean, you can see a lot of shots in here where you're just like, okay, yeah, this is a computer model. And it looks a little, too beginning of Amazing Stories esque. But then there are other times where I think possibly, and this is just me putting that out there, that people might think there are some things that are being done with models, as has been kind of done before, going all the way back to, gosh, beginning of cinema, or, especially in things like Star Wars or 2001 A Space Odyssey. And they see things in here and they think if they look too good, they're models, they're not computer generated. Kind of interesting that everyone in the trailer park seems to know about Alex's fondness for the Starfighter game, and they actually don't see it as him shirking his duties, but instead they're very supportive of his gameplay, coming out and cheering him as he conquers the game. This is a very interesting section of the film because we're going to have a lot of very quick succession of beats here. We've got Alex having this moment of triumph, and then we're going to have his mother dealing him the news that his scholarship application has been rejected. It's another economic hurdle that Alex can't overcome. So much for the city on the hill that Ronald Reagan had promised. I don't think it's any coincidence that this is coming out in 1984. We're right in the middle of the Reagan era, and this whole idea of Alex trying to get out and fulfill his American dream just isn't necessarily as easy as it had been promised. Pinning everything on his wishes from the Starlight Starbright. I mentioned Amazing Stories earlier, and we should probably keep in mind that this was released 1 year before Young Sherlock Holmes, and that was, I think, the first film to have a computer generated character, albeit it was the two-dimensional knight that comes out of the stained glass in a church. Fortunately, Lewis is not too obnoxious and not too in this movie. The bratty younger brother trope is usually pretty awful. I should say, too, that 1984 was really the year for Catherine Mary Stewart. This film came out in June, while Night of the Comet was originally slated for July of 1984, and then it came out in November 16th, 1984, which is, perfect for a Thanksgiving movie. And then, like I said, most of her scenes take place at night. According to Stewart, she was still working on Days of Our Lives during the day, and then Last Starfighter at night. She loved the experience, but said it was absolutely grueling.
Diarrhea.
She has only the one scene with Greg, the gunner from Alex's ship, and she had absolutely no scenes with Centauri, the Robert Preston character, though she did end up meeting Robert Preston during some pickup shooting. That was after principal photography, and she talked more with O'Herlihy when they were both doing ADR for the film. And she thanked his sonorous voice because she was not able to recognize him without the makeup. One story goes that she didn't even know what he looked like without makeup and had to put two and two together when people around him were calling him Dan during the ADR sessions. Then she finally realized, oh, it's Dan O'Herlihy. Both Stewart and Lance Guest gave a lot of credit to Nick Castle for always being in a good mood on the set, and that he and screenwriter Jonathan Betchell worked so closely. Sometimes they would rewrite scenes right on the spot if they weren't working.
He brought it by the diner, and well, I was so excited I opened it.
Oh, that's okay. What is it?
It's about your loan.
Alex's mother here is being played by Barbara Boson, who at the time was
Still go to
enjoying a nice run on Hill Street Blues. People talk about this being the golden age of television, in the post Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones type world. But I have to say, man, living in the early 80s and having things like St. Elsewhere and Hill Street Blues, it was a pretty remarkable time as well. Alex wants to get out of the Starlight Starbright trailer park, which he kind of seems like a refuge for quirky characters, though he's a little reluctant. And I know he talks about how he'll come back for Mags after he gets his scholarship for his college, which now has, been crushed. Could be that outer space a little bit too far for him to go. It could also be that he's afraid of shirking responsibility. Alex is in a family without a father, and that's a role that he's assumed. His mother seems to be both the owner of the trailer park, or at least the manager, as well as working at a diner. She talked earlier about working lunch and dinner shifts. And I think she has ceded her responsibilities for the park to him and making him the de facto handyman and the de facto father in the family. Note the use of red around here. There's the red sign that we had when he was crushing up his scholarship letter. There's the red there for the trailer court sign, which we saw earlier. And then when he steps into Centauri's car or looks inside of there, it's very red as well. I think that they're trying to tell us that there's some danger going on, just kind of psyching us out a little bit because we know eventually that Centauri is one of the good guys.
You're looking at him. Alex Rogan. Who are you?
According to Lance Guest, the original title of this was Centauri's Recruit.
It is? It is. We have to talk about
Rather than writing the role of Centauri for Robert Preston as has been repeatedly written, Guest told me that the role was rewritten to fit more the Professor Harold Hill mold once Preston agreed to come aboard. This was actually Preston's last theatrical feature, though he would go on to do a few more TV movies before he passed away in 1987. And he is in top form here. You would never know that this man is just a few years from the end of his life.
He's got a little proposition for you.
I grew up mostly with Preston as the manager character, I suppose that's a good word for him, in Victor Victoria. So wonderful in that. And then this role as well.
What are you doing? Listen, Centauri wants to keep it for a
They said that the toughest thing to do for this entire movie was matching Centauri's star car with a computer model. You know, the star car was designed by Gene Winfield, who helped design a lot of famous vehicles. The spinners in Blade Runner, he did that with Sid Mead. He also designed the Catmobile, driven by Eartha Kitt in the Batman TV show. He also, from what I've read, has designed the original shuttlecraft for Star Trek. The Star Car was actually a Volkswagen van chassis that had been extended 14 inches, and it has a VW engine, so it actually can drive around.
Who pesters the magician to tell you his tricks? Who sneaks downstairs to peek at his Christmas presents? No, of course you're not.
Winfield worked with Kevin Rafferty in the special effects department. This was actually Rafferty's first credited role, though he would go on to work on a few little productions. There was something called The Phantom Menace, something called Men in Black 2, and he is actually still working as a visual effects supervisor at the time of this recording, just as Gene Winfield, from what I understand, is still working on custom cars. There's some very smart decisions here as far as the integration of the computer-generated effects, you know, and doing the filmed practical effects and just kind of cross-cutting between the outside of the car, the medium shots, the interior. Very, very smart. And then later on, when we have some gun battles out in space, we're going to see a lot of explosions coming from outside of the car, outside of the ships, which are going to reflect onto our character's face, really integrate them well that way. When Preston was in that makeup to have his face off, he could not see a darn thing. There's some nice behind the scenes footage of him being walked out to this car and not having any idea where he's going. You got to remember too, this was a year before Marty McFly would travel in a DeLorean. The filmmakers behind Back to the Future would actually pay a tribute to The Last Fighter. If you take a look on the street of Hill Valley in Back to the Future 2, you can actually see the star car sitting there. So I mentioned John Whitney Jr., whose company did the effects for The Last Starfighter. He also had worked on effects for things like Michael Crichton's Westworld and Looker, and he was the son, believe it or not, of John Whitney Sr., who was a fascinating artist, and he was IBM's first artist in residence, and he worked even with Saul Bass to do the credit sequence on Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, so no slouch there. And according to production designer Ron Cobb, he originally met Whitley Jr. When they were on Alien before the production eventually got moved over to England. And after Conan the Barbarian, which Rob did the effects for, Whitley got back in touch with him and invited him to be an art director at Digital Productions. Kind of goes without saying that this whole movie had to be storyboarded in order to provide a blueprint for the integration between the live action and the computer generated images. And Ron Cobb would work with artist Rick Sternbach on the storyboards. And Sternbach also developed texture maps for the computer rendered space scenes. Sternbach would go on to work on things like Star Trek The Next Generation, Voyager, Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Nemesis. I kind of wonder if Sternbach might be able to shed some light on one of the most famous props in The Last Starfighter, which I will call out once we get there.
Guitar. Guitar.
Ron Cobb designed all the creatures, and Terry Smith was in charge of bringing them to life. Cobb had worked with Castle and Carpenter on Dark Star, which was a real pioneer in what some people call the used universe look. Dark Star is one of the messiest ships in the galaxy. It's a very far cry from the sterile world of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Kind of goes without saying that this film was done, or the filming, the live action filming, I should say, was finished a lot earlier than this movie was released. It was released June 22nd, 1984. The live action shooting took about 40 days. Digital production work on The Last Starfighter, though, started in January of 1982, and it ran until April of 1984, including 3 months of pre-production. And a finished frame for this would take 40 full minutes to render. And this is back when I think we've gotten away from this now, but my goodness, hearing about polygons and how they affected computer animation, that used to be the thing. If you read about this film, you'll read the polygon count like crazy.
Someday these cheapskates will thank Centauri, trust me. Hula!
The age difference between Alex and his little brother Lewis are pretty interesting as well. You know, I talked about how Alex is the de facto father in the family, and Alex being so much older than Lewis, I think, also puts him in that father role. While it seems that Alex may be sexually active with Mags, Lewis is either going through puberty or just kind of aping the ritual of puberty with his Playboy magazines, which I can only assume belong to Alex. This whole thing with the beta unit is a little reminiscent of John Carpenter's 1984 film Starman. It's a really smart thing having this whole beta unit storyline here, because you've got him as a fish out of water on Earth, and then you've got Alex as a fish out of water at the Star League, and in both storylines, he literally is fearing for his life. I love the effects there. Last Starfighter came out after War Games, which really set up the whole nerdy white male hero, which ran concurrently through the 80s with the overbuilt macho heroes like Rambo, Commando. I mean, it's very interesting that Alex can be as much of a hero as your John Rambo character. You know, War Games came out in 83, and right around that same time, the whole Strategic Defense Initiative, colloquially known as Star Wars, that was announced March 23rd, 83. It was this idea of a deterrent in space, very much like the Star League's Frontier. Though listening to interviews about The Last Starfighter, they didn't compare it necessarily to Star Wars as far as Reagan's defense system. They more compared it to the wall on Skull Island, which protected the natives from King Kong. And that whole idea of gameplay turned into warfare was really very much explored in war games, and would be brought up a lot of times when talking about present day drone delivered destruction. A few years ago, the shorthand was, oh, recruit all those video game nerds. They can do drone warfare better than anyone.
I don't believe this.
I love that the aliens are wearing baseball caps. It's pretty awesome. Kind of just proving that baseball caps are a pretty universal thing.
As you all know, we have been on a desperate quest to find starfighters and navigators.
I mentioned Dark Star earlier, and there's more than that, more than Dark Star being a connection between so many of the folks here. There's a lot of connection between the folks here with Halloween. Nick Castle was actually the Shape. He was Michael Myers in the original Halloween. Lance Guest was in Halloween 2, and then Dan O'Herlihy was in Halloween 3. So according to Guest, Castle actually saw him for the first time when John Carpenter was doing some editing of Halloween 2, and kind of put him on the short list for Starfighter because he was in pre-prod at that time. And then Dan O'Herlihy was having a great renaissance in the 80s thanks to Halloween 3, The Last Starfighter, RoboCop 1 and 2, and Twin Peaks, where he played Andrew Packard.
Because of a dark betrayal.
It's interesting to think just how few starfighters they have, that they expect this little group to take on the entire Kodan armada.
For of all the billions of creatures in the Star League, only you few were found to possess the gift. You, and you alone, stand between us and the black terror of the Kodan.
In the old days, when we talked about computer generated effects, it was pretty much computer readouts. So things like that ending scene of War Games with Whopper doing all the different simulations, or the on-screen stuff that we have here of Endurin and all of the readouts. In so many stories, it is the rule of three. So we're going to get this whole idea of the three things that scare Alex away. And one of those is the victory or death chant, I believe. And finally, we're over half an hour into the story, and we finally have Greg here.
Hi, I'm Alex Rogan. I was playing this game back home, and this guy came.
I was talking about how Alex is without a father, and I can see where he might see Centauri as a father figure until he's disillusioned to find out that Centauri is only really in it for the money. And then even that, though, when we have that moment of Centauri's alleged demise later on, it becomes a really emotional moment for Alex. And finally, he finds a better father figure in Grieg, though Grieg already has a family, quite an extensive family. Oh, here we are. Here's the prop. This prop right here, we have seen it in so many things. This is the prop that's blinking and flashing and beeping in Airplane 2. I believe it's in Star Trek 2. If it's not the same prop, it's pretty damn close in Attack of the Clones. So it's had its life. I'm sure there are more appearances of it that I'm not even aware of.
He does have the gift. This may come as a bit of a shock to you. But he doesn't want to be a starfighter. Doesn't want to be a
Yeah, Preston is just floored that Alex would not want to go through with this, though he will do anything to not give back the money.
The games, to merchandise them, to get them into the stores by Christmas.
So yeah, I was just saying that Grieg is quite a father, very prolific as a father. We're going to see a lot of family photos later on.
He could be the greatest starfighter ever.
And that he fights the Kodan Armada because his whole family has been enslaved.
I thought it was a game, but it was also a test. Aha! A test.
With that Grieg mask, apparently it initially took 90 minutes to apply that, and they got it down to 45 minutes by the end of production. Every day they would use a new mask for Dan O'Herlihy, and the only thing that he asked was not to be called to set for makeup, only to sit around, because he would some days be in that makeup for 15 or 16 hours, which got pretty darn hot, I imagine. I don't think I'm reading too much into this, that there's a real father-son relationship at the heart of the conflict in The Last Starfighter. Of course, here we have the petulant Zur, who has betrayed his own father, and his father being named Endurin. Of course, that brings to mind the word endure, like all good fathers should. This also kind of reminds me of a movie with another strong father-son story, or even a double father-son relationship, and that is 1978's Superman the movie. We saw the scene earlier with Alex where he's there by the postal boxes and his friends are in the back of a pickup truck, and it always reminds me of the scene in Superman where Clark Kent meets his friends at the end of the driveway and is waiting there, and they, just like how in this one they're in the back of a pickup truck, in that one there's a convertible, and as they pull away, they've got the one guy saying, "I told you it was an oddball." And in this, it's very much, but also because Alex has pretty much just insulted them about how he's not going to go to City College and get drunk every weekend and polish his truck.
Hear me, Rylands.
I have to say these hologram effects are very good.
Moon of Galan is eclipsed. Kodan Armada will invade.
It's very nice of Zur to tell them exactly when the war is going to start.
We shall see, Zor. We shall see.
Dan O'Herlihy's Grig shares kind of a similar look with Morgan Woodward's character, Cayman, I believe it is, in Battle Beyond the Stars. Just as Lord Krill, who we're about to see, seemed to inspire Robin Sachs' character, General Rothar Saras, in Galaxy Quest, complete with his space-age monocle. And I can really see other parallels, too, between Galaxy Quest and Battle Beyond the Stars and The Last Starfighter. In this one, the Rylands are such a peaceful people, kind of like the Theramans in Galaxy Quest or the Akir in Battle Beyond the Stars, that they actually have to recruit beings to do the fighting for them. With Battle Beyond the Stars, of course, that is from the Seven Samurai. And the twist in The Last Starfighter is that all of the samurai just get wiped out except for one, the reluctant samurai. He doesn't want to be a samurai. He just wants to go someplace other than City College. Thank you very much.
Let him enter.
And the Kodan Armada, led here by Lord Krill, possibly named after the sea crustacean, though the Kodan look a lot more reptilian and they kind of act insectile. They kind of remind me of the Formix of Ender's Game, or even the Borg, this whole idea of the hive mind. And the film, to me, shares similarities with Ender's Game. It's the book, that is, in the idea that the protagonist was playing a simulation against an overwhelming force, and Ender's Game very similar, though in that we finally find out, spoilers for Ender's Game, that he is not necessarily playing a simulation, that the things he's doing are being done against the enemy, so he ends up, wiping them out through his simulations because they are real. And Ender's Game, the book or the novelette, came out in 1978 in Analog Magazine, and then the book came out 1 year after this, 1985. Poor Alex Rogan is very much aware that he is in battle as opposed to just playing a game. I don't know if we'll necessarily talk about how Alex has to murder a whole lot of Kodans in this. It's probably better not to think of that. I've always been fascinated too by there being the different aliens and wondering what their social hierarchy is, because Lord Krill and the guy next to him obviously are one thing, and the rest of the guys on the ship are another, and they've got that great kind of computerized voice, almost sounding like a Cylon. The use of weapons as asteroids is kind of reminiscent to me of the Battle of Klendathu from Starship Troopers. And of course, we can ill afford another Klendathu. Likewise, this whole attack on the base and the traitor in their midst also reminds me of the Harkonnen attack on Arrakis in David Lynch's Dune.
Activate automatic repulsor gun.
The only thing that wasn't computer generated in these things was the explosions. Oh, he's so shifty. A nice eye light on him. With his, like, a dealer type visor that he has on. I expect he's going to start dealing poker for us. This very much feels like you're going to lose in Tempest. This whole weird phallic symbol that he has with this scepter feels like he's maybe coming up short in a few other areas. I do have to admit, though, this actor, he does a terrific job. I mean, really, there's not one performance in here that I think is clunky whatsoever. I think everybody is really firing on all cylinders.
It's only a few more miles from here. I guess I can walk it. So long.
And like I said before, you can't get better than Robert Preston.
Oh, Alex! Here.
This whole idea of having the beta unit subplot also allows for the whole cross-cutting of the two stories, which, especially later on, give us more impact. This whole idea of, will Alex be found to still be alive or not?
If you change your mind, just tap the communocrystals.
When I spoke to Lance Guest a few years ago for the projection booth episode on The Last Starfighter, he told me that he worked, since he was both Alex and the beta unit, he worked 35 out of the 38 days of production.
Think the Ulus were too ugly to save.
Who's Goloka?
Never mind.
Listen, Centauri, I'm not any of those.
And he was very appreciative of Nick Castle working with him.
Then that's all you'll ever be.
I think he said it was a 38-day shoot, but they ended up going 5 or 6 days over. And I think he told Starlog that to him it was confusing because sometimes the way a scene is shot would determine how it had to be played. And if you read the script, you got the impression on how a scene should be played, but then when you're on set and the director's blocking it, you can get called in to do it really differently. And you have to coordinate that whole thing right then and there. Sometimes the director can't do what the writer created because of the logistics of shooting. So even if you've done all your homework ahead of time, you still have to be prepared for the changes. And he said that Nick knew what he wanted and shot only what he needed. He had definitely learned that from John Carpenter as far as not shooting, your wide, your mediums, your close-ups, and then being able to pick that later on in the editing room. It sounds like Castle would only shoot what he wanted. One thing that Catherine Mary Stewart had said was that she was very conscious about playing to Alex, playing to Lance Guest as Alex, even when she was playing against Lance Guest when he was playing the beta unit. She didn't want her performance to change just because of who she was allegedly acting against.
Huh? I was in the star car, remember? We shook hands. I became you.
You have to admit the acting of Lance Guest versus Lance Guest is pretty great. And there are times later, like when he's trying to make a decision where he's actually, quote unquote, talking to himself and giving himself a little bit of a pep talk.
Wait a minute. What are you doing back? Are you kidding? It's war up there. Oh.
I'm trying to see his hair to see if it is different, because they actually bolstered some of these beta unit scenes after they did test screenings. I think this is legit. I think later on we're going to see what Lance gets called a funky wig. This hitchhiker here, played by Mark Alamo, not somebody that you necessarily see out of makeup too often, at least if you're a fan of Deep Space Nine, because he played Gul Dukat on Deep Space Nine, the Cardassian. It's very nice of Centauri to build in all of these protocols inside of the game, like to take away any sort of Zandozan's disguises. The Zandozans, for whatever reason, they always reminded me of Ree-Yees from Return of the Jedi. I don't know if that's on purpose or not, but just something about their design. The Ree-Yees had 3 eyes, and these guys only have 2. And unfortunately, these masks don't have a lot of mobility. And that's the one thing I can say, too, about the other starfighters that we saw, is that the masks look good, but it's not like they have a lot of movement to them. Like I could see the one alien's eyes moving around a little bit, and his mouth opens just a little teeny bit, but it's not as good as some of the mask work I've seen in other things. Along with War Games and Tron, The Last Starfighter definitely played in that whole geek chic that would be embraced by things like Ready Player One, speaking of Spielberg. Like Tron, the main character of Ready Player One spends the majority of his time inside of a video game, and like The Last Starfighter, our character lives in a multi-tiered trailer park, albeit the tiers are a lot closer together. Ernest Cline, the author of Ready Player One, would pay more of an homage to The Last Starfighter with his second book, which is called Armada. The description of Armada in Wikipedia reads, quote, "The story follows a teenager who plays an online video game about defending against an alien invasion, only to find out that the game is a simulator that prepares him and people around the world for defending against the actual alien invasion, unquote. So other than that word online, that's a pretty dead-on description of The Last Starfighter. Plus, don't forget that Centauri has apparently created a whole bunch of these Starfighter video consoles and arcade games and have placed them throughout because he talks about how he had to have them ready in time for Christmas.
Shit. Come on, Alex, don't be such a wimp.
Finally, what everyone's been waiting for, Robert Preston with a laser gun. It is nice to see an alien with such, shall we call them rustic clothes. It was Richard Fletcher was in charge of the costumes, and he wanted to get away from the typical spaceman outfits, except you'll see Alex's spacesuit looks very similar to the outfits that Fletcher designed for Star Trek films, especially Kirk's very spiffy away party jacket from Wrath of Khan.
Compliments of Zur.
Sewer? Why is he after me?
Somehow he found out you're a starfighter.
Well, you see, Alex, you gotta go back. You got no choice. Because if you stay down here, you're dog food.
Trust Centauri, my boy. Because in 2 hours, this place will be crawling with 10 Zandozans.
The film, unfortunately, was not as well liked as I liked this film. I saw this, I think, when I was 12 years old and just totally fell in love with it. And yeah, the reviews I read anyway were not that good. A lot of people had trouble that the end scene just kind of happens a little too quickly.
Sorry. Beta, get a doctor.
No native cures, no witch doctors. I'm fine. Just a scratch.
You know, like I said before, the numbers of the budget may vary. The reported box office take for The Last Starfighter was about 30 million, which, if the budget was 22 million, did not mean it was a runaway hit. The genre press at the time was not too kind. The review in Starburst magazine said that the film was, quote, too derivative to be satisfying, and called it a, quote, exasperating experience with a predictable conclusion. Screen International's reviewer complained of a, quote, surprising lack of thrills, blaming a lack of meaningful conflict on Jonathan Beschel's script.
Centauri to Starfighter Command. Centauri to Starfighter Command. Come in, please.
Variety reviewer Kim Newman did not appreciate the intercutting from Alex in space back to the Beta unit, and he also wrote that the Kodan were, quote, not terribly fearsome, and defeated with, quote, remarkable ease.
Hey, Centauri. All personnel, star car approaching docking bay 12.
Centauri! Centauri! Hey, hit the brakes!
Fortunately, Grigg is still alive.
Greg! Hey, Greg! Alex! You got Centauri. It's hurt. He's right over here.
I was talking about Craig Saffin's score earlier, and it's really remarkable that he was able to produce something as majestic as he did, because when he was brought in, he was talking about how he just was seeing dots on a screen that were supposed to represent ships. So he was just scoring the dots rather than scoring any sort of magnificent space battles.
Piles and piles of
But I would put this score right up there with some of the better ones. I mean, this theme is as memorable to me as something like Alan Silvestri's theme for Back to the Future, or even some of John Williams's themes from around the same time. I mentioned Superman the movie earlier, and I would say that this is up there. It really is good.
Until the next dimension, old friend. I'm sorry, Alex.
Centauri?
Not only was this a movie, but it was also a comic book. It was adapted by Marvel, which was kind of a mainstay for the day. That was their thing, was doing a lot of comic adaptations. I had the one for Dune. There was one for Buckaroo Banzai. And of course, Alan Dean Foster wrote the novelization. I think it was more rare that he didn't write the novelization of something. And while I was doing research to talk about this on the projection booth, I was able to uncover the 24-page read-along book and cassette. This seems like it might be a little too mature for kids that need read-along cassettes, but I don't know. It appeals. It appealed to me at 12 years old. I imagine it really would have appealed to me when I was 8 years old. Some of these beta unit scenes were added after test audiences were receptive to the comic relief of the scenes. You can see in this sequence when we've got Alex's head off here, that Lance Guest was wearing what he called a goofy wig. He was also very sick at this time, and you can see in some of the close-ups that he might not look as healthy as he did before.
Lewis! Oh, no.
Am I to understand there's a beta unit taking your place back home?
He's trying.
So it's safe to assume that Zurith thinks you're still on Earth.
Yeah.
That could work to our advantage, theoretically. Ah, now you look human.
Is this my Gunstar?
This is a prototype, different from the other ships. She has greater range, more power, and a slight weapons modification. And of course, she's got deflector plating, so she can withstand several direct hits. From here, this is where I navigate the ship, maintain life support and propulsion systems.
Okay, so what do I say?
Way up there, in the gunnery chair. Hang on!
Okay.
Now, climb into the gunnery chair. Now, I'm moving you into launch position. There in front of you are the two switches for your heads-up display. Turn them on. While you're engaging the...
This heads-up display, of course, brings to mind the whole idea of this being a video game movie and then eventually a video game, though there was no video game. There is a mention in the credits of an Atari game coming soon, and that didn't happen. The film was turned into a tabletop game, a role-playing game from FASA in 1984 called The Last Starfighter Tunnel Chase. And actually, if they did come out with a game for The Last Starfighter probably would have been very much like the chase at the end of Star Wars through the tunnels on the Death Star. Not tunnels, canyons.
Now, are you ready? All systems.
And it probably would have used the same exact engine inside with that kind of 3D-ness. So there have been a few things related to Last Starfighter video games. There was a game being developed at the time, and then it was released 2 years later as Star Raiders 2. And then in 1990, Nintendo released a game under The Last Starfighter, but it was actually a modified Commodore game called Uridium. Then all the way in 2007, there was a freeware version of the game that actually recreated the arcade experience for the PC. The creators of that game, Rogue Synapse, even created a working arcade version, and I'm very curious. There is a extra that came with the DVD that had Lance Guest buy an arcade version of the game, and I'm not sure if that was the recreation or if that was a prop from the actual movie.
Star against the Armada. I've always wanted to fight a desperate battle against incredible odds.
Also, I should say that The Last Starfighter was not successful enough to merit a toy tie-in line, though there were prototypes made for about a dozen figures by Galoob, and these would have been articulated 4-inch figures, even including a Centauri with a removable face. Nick Castle described the setting of The Last Starfighter as having all the schmaltz of a musical without the music. And he told Starlog that he had no interest in doing science fiction. Quote, I really wanted to direct musicals and romantic comedies. I think that's why The Last Starfighter turned out the way it did. It has kind of a broad 40s feel. Coincidentally, then, The Last Starfighter was turned into an off-Broadway musical in 2004. Lance Guest was telling me that it was being workshopped at the same place and time when Colin Escott and Floyd Mutrux were in production of The $1 Million Quartet, where Guest played Johnny Cash. So he said that he would walk into one room where some actor was basically trying to be him, and then he would go to another room and try to be Johnny Cash. Unfortunately, I never saw the Last Starfighter musical, but I do own the soundtrack, which was put out by Kritzerland Records. There's one thing that Lance Guest also said, that he really tried to, or was told to, play it up as far as being a little bit more broad, that he would get into his own head a little bit. So he had to kind of play up these actions, especially as Beta. It's one of those rare scenes where Catherine Mary Stewart actually gets to be out in the daytime.
Did you smell anything?
Like what?
Like a zzz. Forget it.
So as I said before, the numbers of the budget vary quite a bit. The reported box office take, though, of The Last Starfighter was right around $30 million. And if its budget was $22 million, obviously it's not a runaway hit.
Make it up to each other tonight, Silver Lake?
Other big box office winners from 1984 included The Karate Kid, Ghostbusters, and Footloose. 84 was a really interesting year in terms of fare aimed at preteens and teenagers. This was the year that parents outcried the level of violence in two of the biggest hits of the summer, Gremlins and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Those films would, of course, bring about the addition of a PG-13 rating.
Squadrons? How many squadrons?
It isn't the number of squadrons that concerns me. It's this communication turret that sends out the commands to the deck fighters, which enables them to act as one.
Of all the films that I just mentioned, it's interesting that all of them either got sequels or reboots or both. as I'm sitting here in 2020 recording this commentary, there actually would have been another Ghostbusters movie happening this year, if not for the global pandemic. I think they did a really smart thing with the muting of the color scheme of these ships, kind of giving them that, again, used universe look and avoiding the candy-colored objects flying around screen. If you look at the Gunstar that Alex is flying, I suppose, they even added some dents and dings to avoid making them look as crisp and pristine as computer models usually do.
Congratulations, Alex. This is your first.
And then when it comes to the enemy ships that we'll see soon, Ron Cobb actually picked up a few details from World War II dive bombers to give them a little bit more of a sinister look.
I've lost its beamer frequency, so I can't report back to the Armada. Fire when ready.
Great, wait.
So with this not being a big hit, there was no Last Starfighter 2. Though I have to say that this fits in well with a few other video game movies at the time. I already mentioned Tron and War Games, which came before. There was also The Wizard that came out 5 years later, which played more upon the popularity of home video consoles, and as well as Cloak and Dagger, which also, I believe, had a MacGuffin as far as a video game. And that came out in '84 as well. I mentioned briefly the whole idea of video arcades having a bad reputation. In 1983, Vienna, Virginia actually banned any establishment from having more than 3 arcade games. And in 1984, Bloomfield, New Jersey required that any establishment with over 20 arcade games also employ their own private security force. There were also ordinances passed in other cities to stop children under 16 from playing video games, which is always a tough thing because at least I didn't have any sort of ID until I turned 18 to say how old I was.
I shall take you home. You still may live a
There was a great mockumentary short on Saturday Night Live in 1982 called Alan, a Video Junkie, where they talked about one little girl who would do anything to play video games, making her money, quote, 1 quarter at a time. I'm not sure what was worse in the 1980s, panic over video games or the satanic panic that caused people to think that there were massive satanic rituals happening, especially in children's daycares. So the demonization as well as the video game crash that I mentioned might be some of the reasons why The Last Starfighter didn't get a sequel, though it is definitely primed for one. At the end, kind of like Darth Vader flying away at the end of Star Wars, The Last Starfighter also ends with the film's baddie, Zur, getting away and leaving us wide open for something. Another reason why we haven't had a sequel or a reboot or remake also is that Jonathan Betchel allegedly won't give up the rights, and in 2014, Seth Rogen tweeted that even Steven Spielberg couldn't get the project going. There was allegedly a sequel script written by Gary Whitta, who also wrote After Earth and Rogue One, a Star Wars story, and ironically, I think he also wrote the video game for Back to the Future 2. That was 2014. Then in 2018, Whitta tweeted out some concept art for a sequel, which he claimed he was writing with Jonathan Betchel. But back in 2014, there were stories about Betchel working on a TV series called Starfighter Chronicles. But even all the way back in '85, Betchel was discussing a sequel saying, quote, "They've just won the opening skirmish of a great battle, and we know that the starfighters are wiped out. Suppose Alex had to return to Earth and recruit others. because, of course, Centauri didn't make just one Starfighter game. He had them shipped to stores by Christmas, as he says.
Glyphoid. 6,000 little Griglings.
At the 25th anniversary screening of the film, Nick Castle spoke to Lance Guest and Catherine Mary Stewart about his idea for a sequel, which would have had Alex and Mag's kid pick up the Starfighter mantle, which may have required this movie to get a new name called The Next to the Last Starfighter.
Caves above ground. See, here's my family.
But long story short, if you're a Last Starfighter fan, I would not hold my breath for a new Starfighter property anytime soon.
We live in a mobile home. That's a cave that goes places. Only we never.
After The Last Starfighter released, Nick Castle was in talk with the producer of the film, Gary Adelson, and screenwriter Jonathan Betchell about a film called Elves. This obviously never happened. Instead, Adelson and Castle would go on to work on The Boy Who Could Fly, while Betchell wrote and directed My Science Project, which came out August 9th, 1985. Castle described Elves as being a detective novel about a relationship between a New York cop and an elf. Both Castle and Betchell, in separate interviews, called the film Capra-esque. I have a feeling that the project eventually turned into Jonathan Betchell's last credited role as a writer, director, producer, Theodore Rex, which has Whoopi Goldberg as a cop paired with a dinosaur, not an elf.
Two more dead ahead. Charging fast.
So we just need to remember here in the film that right now Zur thinks that Alex is dead. The Zandozans are hunting the beta unit, but they have yet to report back to him. So all of this fighting that's going on really is more guerrilla fighting, and Alex just picking off little fighters here and there. And they have introduced this idea of the Death Blossom, which was not part of the video game, though it does remind me of Defenders. I think Stargate Defender was the name of the game, where you had a pretty much kill 'em all option. So I'm not really sure why anybody would have a problem with this cross-cutting. I think it's also very clever that they are casting a police officer here as one of the Zandozans. He's definitely moved up in the world, or the Zandozans have. I know it's a different bounty hunter. Definitely not as handsome as the bounty hunter from Critters. I think one reviewer was saying that I don't know if they were misremembering or if they were trying to make a joke, something about that the beta unit would go on the fritz when Mags would put her tongue in his ear. I guess thinking that maybe he wasn't waterproof. Or maybe mixing that up with the moth that was so loud in the earlier scene. We're also empathizing with the beta unit here because of those things like the moth from the earlier scene, where we're hearing it from his ears. And with this one, we're also hearing from his ears and seeing things with his eyes as he's trying to win back Mags.
Come on. You're my Juliet, my Venus.
You're my Juliet. My Venus.
I don't think it's any coincidence that we have the cop as the Zandozan, or Zandozan as cop, I should say, as far as this whole idea of the figures of authority, and Alex being a nice young teenage man trying to win his way through the world and definitely having a suspicion of authority.
All right, I give up. I'm not Alex Rogan.
What?
I'm a beta unit. I'm an executive.
Oh man, wouldn't you know, a cop comes just at the wrong time. But at the right time to show Mags that he is not the man she thought he was. Again, great music cues from Craig Safin, keeping it very lively.
No, I'm not. I'm not staying anywhere till I find out what's going on.
And now upping more of the tension with this chase, an actual motivated car chase instead of just being a car chase, and intercutting that with our outer space footage. And we haven't really talked about Alex basically being a pretty cold-blooded murderer of all these creatures. I know they talk in the reviews about how the Kodan army is so easily defeated, but I don't know if we really want to emphasize just how many Kodan people or creatures Alex has to kill. Of course, this hiding out in a asteroid, meteoroid, very reminiscent of The Empire Strikes Back. But this whole idea of subterfuge, this being one lone fighter against a overwhelming army, something that Grigg has always wanted to face. I've also found it interesting that Grigg is not a starfighter, that he's more the second in command.
Alex, in space?
I kind of wish that Mags had been the driver in this scene, because she doesn't have a whole lot of stuff to do in this movie. Might have been a little bit nicer if she were the one to save the beta unit's bacon. But then again, I guess he is about to make the ultimate sacrifice.
There it is. All right. When I get this signal, we're gonna jump. Okay?
What do you mean, jump?
We're gonna ram them.
What?
Extermination Emissary Zeta 6-1 message.
Ready?
I absolutely love the hubris of Zur when he immediately jumps to the conclusion that the last two words being sent are "is dead," as if that was such an important message. I'm not going to get into the entire idea of how long it takes these messages to travel through space. I think that would be really pedantic. Just like I won't necessarily talk about how nobody has trouble understanding Grigg at the end of the film, even though none of them have the same translator buttons that Alex has on his uniform. We can assume that Grigg is fluent in English. Sure, why not?
The command ship.
That was always the problem with computer effects like this. These look really good, but in too many other things, they don't take into account the chemical process of film versus the
Thanks, Greg.
computing process that we have. And I did read in this, oh, that's actually the father in that photo is our cinematographer, King Baggett.
I love you, Alex Rogan.
6,
Heads-up display. Check.
5,
Lasers. Check.
4,
Particle beam. Check.
3.
Proton pulse. Check. 2.
I did read an article where they actually were taking into account the idea of film being more of a chemical process and the way that things can look too perfect when it comes to the computer effects. So they did talk even back then about adding blur, motion blur. Even there's a turnaround at one point where they were talking about adding some lines, almost like animation lines, to emphasize that it was turning.
The last Starfighter is dead.
Luckily, they didn't go so far as to add like little puffs of dust when a ship comes to a complete stop.
I am the Emperor of Rylos. I and I alone command this entire... Release me! I command you... You will pay for this with your life!
All guns, fire!
Sometimes the integration of the live action explosions with the computer effects aren't necessarily as good as they could be, but I don't think they had anything close to the particle technology that we have now to be able to create an explosion that looked at all believable. I can't even imagine, speaking of polygons, how many polygons that would have taken to create that. This whole thing with the eyes coming out, I love that. Also reminds me of the moment, I think it's in Flash Gordon. Is it Flash Gordon, or it could be the black hole, when a navigator's helmet's taken off and you get to see how grody it looks underneath it. And you think about a shot like this with all of these fighters coming up. I mean, this actually right here reminds me a lot of the Guardians of the Galaxy, with that whole idea of the ships coming together and being locked together, trying to stop the bad guys from coming to the planet. Also think about things like 1983's Return of the Jedi and just how many ships were flying around. That was really that kind of start of the, hey, let's confuse the audience rather than entertain them. But here we have all of these ships, and they're all being computer generated instead of being done with models, and it's pretty astounding. There's no way I think you could set up something like that with models and have it look nearly as good.
Do not trigger DB until we're within range. Just use your laser.
I mean, I genuinely appreciate practical effects a lot more than digital effects, but I appreciate this movie that they are trying something new. I've always wondered if it's like one of those situations where, everyone who heard the Velvet Underground started their own rock band. Did everybody who saw The Last Starfighter want to go into digital effects and animation? Again, that was a really nice scene, how we saw the fighter going around him. And this whole idea, too, I mentioned before, as far as the lights that show on their faces. It's a really smart way to integrate the action going on outside with the action inside of the capsule, inside of the Gunstar. Of course, all these ships had their own, names, different types of fighters. I think Death Blossom was actually the name of the appetizer at Outback for a long time. I can't even imagine how nauseous Alex would feel after that.
Did it.
Yes, we actually did, didn't we?
Command ship.
I think, too, part of the problem that people had with this film was that we have both the Commander and Zur, and we didn't necessarily know who to dislike more. And that once Zur is out of there, the Commander doesn't necessarily have as much personality as maybe he should. And I think that might have been part of the problem. It's just we're already disliking, we're actually kind of pulling for, in a strange way, the commander, and we're disliking Zur. So when Zur is out of there, it kind of takes away that motivation. We had Zur as petulant child fighting against his father. We don't necessarily know what's in it for this commander, other than he is under the command of their emperor, the Kodan emperor, who we never necessarily see. So yeah, we don't have a whole lot there. And yeah, they are relatively, once that Death Blossom goes off and murders just about everyone, there's not a whole lot more fighting that goes on.
Guidance system out. Auxiliary steering out. Defense! Defense! She won't answer the helm.
It's one of those where the gameplay is super fun, and then you come to the boss, and it's a little bit too easy to defeat the boss. And as I said, we were talking about fathers before. The father, Endurin, is still alive, surprisingly. All of the starfighters died other than Alex. Thankfully, Grieg made it out as well.
And there is still danger, so I was wondering if you wouldn't be willing to stay on and rebuild the Starfighter Legion.
Wait a minute. Rebuild the Legion?
Yes. Of course you'd...
And Centauri made it as well. So all of the father figures here are alive and well. Which is a little bit of a cheat when it comes to Centauri, but I'm happy to see Robert Preston alive.
Centauri! I thought you were dead. Me? Die and miss all the excitement? Oh, no. I was merely dormant while my body repaired itself. No.
And he's right back to the quick-talking patter, that kind of sideways grin that he has. He's already trying to come up with his next scam.
You've got a good thing going here. Keep smiling. Don't blow it.
And the way that Gunstar integrates or doesn't on that shot is a little rough around the edges, but again, I'm giving him an A for effort. Not only is he the hero of the galaxy, but they want to continue having him be the hero. You can actually see the gears turning in his head.
Assuring Centauri, Grieg, I leave it in your capable hands.
Thankfully, the beta unit died at this point and not, a day earlier, because that would have been really awkward. Would have been no one to fix antennas or turn people's electricity on. And I'm glad that he's very pissed off about his truck being stolen.
Can't say that I have.
Oh, well, ask Maggie. She knows where he is. She was with him.
Maggie, where's Alex?
Yeah, where's my truck? Where's your boyfriend?
Mrs. Rogan, about Alex. You see, he's... Oh, but what's going on? I don't know.
Yeah, I mentioned the script and how Beshel did 14 drafts over a 6-month period. And the last draft that I was able to dig up was from, I think, June of '83. So leaving quite a bit of time before the shooting started on this. But like I said, they had to really do a ton of prep work to be able to do these effects. Though, from what I understand, they were nowhere near where they wanted to be even 6 months before this ended up being released. So they had to cut a lot of corners. So again, I give them big props for their effort on this. though they realized that they just didn't have nearly enough time. I can't remember what the number was, but I remember there being just a huge processor farm for something like a Monsters Inc., which was one of the first films to do really good hair texture. And just each one of those hairs on Sully took so much time to render. And that was, the finest hair we have. And with something like this, you've got some very, plain, flat surfaces, but it still just takes so much time to render at this point. And then when you do the integration, you just do really slight integration, like going behind the ladder, behind the, well, not necessarily a ladder, but the elevator. You would think, to be nice, he would have taken off that helmet on his way down, but doesn't make for nearly as dramatic of a reveal.
Alex?
Hi, Mags.
Alex. Is it you? I mean, is it really you?
I find it interesting that in the radio that we hear in the very first part of this movie, when we're going across the trailer park, we hear mention of unidentified flying objects that were seen just the night before. And I don't imagine that had anything to do with Centauri. That video game had to have been there for a long time, but maybe it's just to kind of set the stage that this is a world where little green men exist.
I've been to another planet, Ma.
I'm glad that they didn't have to show us each one of those misadventures.
And ruin my stove.
Oh, that was a beta unit. Beta unit? A robot.
Come on.
A monster.
If this was a PG-13, I imagine that they would have made Lewis say, "Holy shit," and that would have got them their PG-13 rating. I've probably seen this movie, 3 dozen times, 4, 5 more over the years. And I never noticed that after Grieg shakes at least one person's hand, they end up wiping off their hand. I believe that is Mags here.
And this is Maggie.
So yeah, see that? Whoop. Yeah, looks at her hand and just starts wiping it off.
You must be Lewis. I hear good things about you.
Hear that, slimes? I'm famous.
And this is my mom.
They could tell them any story and they'd believe it right now.
You must all be proud of him. He saved the Star League and hundreds of worlds, including Earth.
The other thing I've never been able to pick out is Will Wheaton. Apparently he is in this movie as one of Lewis's friends. And there are people standing behind Lewis there that seem to be about his age, but I don't see Will Wheaton.
Can I go too, Alex? Can I?
Sorry, Squirt. There's only enough.
Maybe I'll have to tweet him and see if he responds. And just as I was talking about how Alex has his responsibilities, Mags has hers, and her responsibility is to her grandmother, we don't know what Mag's family situation is here. She's worried about taking care of her grandmother, which seems a little bit more legit than Alex feeling the need to take care of his mom. His mom seems to be, well, fairly self-sufficient, though having both the waitressing job and the manager at the trailer park job is a little too much. So hopefully something good will happen for her when Alex leaves. Maybe Otis will pick up the slack a little bit, or I don't think that Lewis is mature enough to do that. Again, I'm overthinking this movie quite a bit. And this is that same moment that they were going to have after he came back from whatever college he went to, and he's just making her have it now rather than later.
Alex, we can't hold off their radar any longer.
Yeah, okay. I can do it, Mom. Bye. Take it easy. So long. So long, everybody.
I really like the resolve on Catherine Mary Stewart's face. You can really see her determination.
Granny, you're sure and right, or whatever it is they do up there.
Though I don't know how she's going to fly without a spacesuit. It's definitely against regulations. And suddenly everybody's an expert on what the spaceship can do. Thank you very much, Otis. You've never seen one of these take off, but you know that it packs a punch. It's kind of nice rather than showing it take off, we're just going to show a lot of lights and smoke and wind. It takes place very, very well. And here we go again, setting up for the sequel. And I do have to say, with the smoke and everything, that looks very nice. Very well rendered. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen to me ramble on about The Last Starfighter. And I hope you've enjoyed hearing more about this movie as much as I have about talking about it. One of those great films from the mid-'80s that just always go back to. Definitely a lot of fun, and hopefully folks can appreciate it a little bit more than they did necessarily when it came out.